Hi, I'm Bonnie Steinroeder, and I'm the pastor.
And I'm John Moore, and I'm the policeman.
And we want to welcome you to, I think it's our third show, right,
it is.
John?
It
Our
is.
Episode of The Pastor and the Policeman. Tonight, we're really privileged and honored to have a live studio audience with us, so welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you could be with us tonight. Tonight, we're going to be discussing marriage equality as it applies to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The purpose of our show is to bring up these constitutional issues, not to say there's a right or a wrong or that we're the experts, but to start a really important discussion in our town about our constitutional rights. So John's going to just talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment.
Right. So the book is entitled From Disgust to Humanity, a very complicated and at times controversial subject. The author was excellent in this book, but maybe I'm speaking from a legal standpoint. There's quite a bit of citation to old cases, legal reasoning, and like Bonnie said, it centers around the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment, the history of the 14th Amendment goes back to Reconstruction times, and it was a way to protect civil rights of people in the South that might be discriminated against. And within the amendment itself, it says that each person will be given equal protection under the law and that they will not be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. So that's the basis for this book. There are a number of issues within it, and we want to go into a few of them. The first one is the title itself, From Disgust to Humanity. The author talks about the politics of disgust and the politics of humanity. And when she references disgust, she talks about a certain morals test that someone will put to a legislature to enact laws that they think are morally just. What they do when they exercise the politics of disgust is they more or less address an activity as opposed to a person.
Right, because I found the title really offensive.
You did.
I know, I told you that
did.
a couple times.
But I see where the author's coming from, and then she moves on to the politics of humanity. And that's seeing the person as opposed to the activity, not trying to impose your own moral standards on someone else, especially if it's activity that someone's trying to regulate that is done in private amongst consenting people. And that's how we get to the subtitle of the book, Sexual Orientation and Constitutional Law. So there are a number of issues to bring up. The issue itself that takes up the majority of the book is the right to same-sex marriage. Now, you marry people.
I do.
You do.
I do. I marry people. I marry heterosexual couples. I marry same-gender couples. And I guess one of the things I would interject here about the 14th Amendment, I didn't realize, I mean, you might be more scholars than I am, but I didn't realize that the 14th Amendment has been the basis for probably the most important decisions in our country, for Brown versus the Board of Education, which stopped the segregation of schools, for women having the right to vote, for people of color having the right to vote, and then in 2015 for marriage equality. And what I learned in studying this a bit, and I actually read Anthony Kennedy's decision, and then I read the dissenting decision on the 2015 Supreme Court case. What he was saying was that you have to show that people are being discriminated against, and he felt that the plaintiff made their case that they were being discriminated against by not having the same right to happiness and the same legal protections as heterosexual couples that could be married. But I didn't realize there is a lot of controversy around the Equal Protection Clause because it originally applied to states. Then it was applied, I think in Brown versus Education, they said, no, it can be applied federally. So it was just really interesting to me to think about, they talk about who is in a protected class that would get protection under this clause. So for me, I learned a lot because to me it was just, because of who I am and what I believe. It's like, well, of course it's a no-brainer for me that anyone should be able to marry. But the issue, the crux for me comes in, and we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. So what if say you believe that it's wrong. I'm not saying you believe that. I know that you don't. But just say that you believe that, or your denomination teaches that it's wrong. Can you hold the view to say, well, I may personally believe it's wrong, my religious institution may believe that it's wrong, but because we are a secular country, we are not based on religion, we have a separation of church and state, and people are afforded this opportunity for equal protection under the 14th Amendment, that no matter what I think or what my religion teaches, people should be able to marry. So I wonder if people can separate that out, because sometimes they can't.
Right, right. So a little bit more of the legal basis in terms of the 14th Amendment. Initially, we had the Bill of Rights, which was the first 10 amendments, and they applied to the federal government. The states were left on their own during that time period. The 14th Amendment applies, and it has case by case, the Bill of Rights to the states. And like Bonnie had said, we're talking about equal protection for people that feel that they've been discriminated against, and in certain instances by the state that they live in. And they've set up a legal parameter in terms of who's entitled to what protection. If you are in what's called a protected class, which would be based on your race, your religion, your nationality, if you feel that you've been discriminated based on that, then the state has to prove that they have a compelling reason to enact and carry out that law.
Right.
And that there's no other way to carry out that purpose. The intermediate level of scrutiny of a statute based on discrimination would be that it's a very important state interest that's at stake, and that's the reason why they wrote the law. And there's one protected class in that, and it's called gender. And then the last area of scrutiny or classification is everyone else. And the state just has to prove that they have a rational basis for the law that they wrote. Now, the issue becomes with sexual orientation in constitutional law, where does that fall?
Right.
Obviously, it doesn't fall in the strict scrutiny highest level. It's not race, it's not religion, it's not national origin. There have been arguments made that it falls into gender, but some of those arguments have fallen short. So that's where we find ourselves.
Right, and I think what Anthony Kennedy said in his decision was he said that he was making the decision not on the basis that gay and lesbian people were a protected class, but that they were the same as anybody else. And because they're the same as anybody else, they should enjoy those same rights and those same privileges. So it's actually the opposite argument. It's not we're going to elevate any group to a protected class. It's that everybody as an American citizen should enjoy the same rights and privileges. So I thought that was interesting. So I feel the issues are personal beliefs versus, the secularism of our country. Mm-hmm. And then the other issue that John and I tossed around that we'd love to hear your opinions about is I was reading some libertarian views, one by Rand Paul and one by somebody else, basically saying, well, let's get the state out of marriage altogether. Let's not even have them issue marriage licenses. If you want to get married in my church, come get married in my church, but the state will have nothing to do with it. Mm-hmm. And at first that seemed like somewhat of a good idea to me. Right. But then I also was thinking through, well, what happens when that marriage dissolves? Right. You had said to me earlier, well, gee, do I want to be the one to preside over who gets what, or how, property and children, right. Or then does it get just turned back for civil litigation anyway? Right.
You get to be there in the joyous event of the marriage itself.
Right.
Do you really want to be there when it falls apart and be, the judge and jury in terms of how things get divided. I mean, you know, I don't think people think about that when they talk about taking the state out of the equation when it comes to marriage. I mean, we have a whole probate court system. We have a civil court system that's stretched to the limit. And if they were then, you know, inundated with people that were suing each other to get out of a marriage where the state isn't involved, then we'd have some problems.
Yeah. So, but it's an interesting debate, and there are people who really feel that we should not have the state involved at all. So those were the major issues I was thinking about to invite the conversation. Did you have anything else before we
just one more thing, and you did reference Justice Kennedy's opinion, and you know, keep this in mind too. This was written in 2015, and most people know Justice Kennedy as, or he did know him as the swing vote on the court, and in fact, that's what he was in this case. It was a 5-4 decision, and he wrote the decision. But just one part that really stuck out to me, and then, you know, I'll ask your opinion, and then we'll throw it to the audience. But he puts in here that the history of marriage is one of both continuity and change. Changes such as the decline in arranged marriages and the abandonment of the law of coverture, which is when someone has to put up money before marriage, have worked deep transformations in the structure of marriage, affecting aspects of marriage once viewed as essential. These new insights have strengthened, not weakened, the institution. Changed understanding of marriage are characteristics of a nation where new dimensions of freedom become apparent to new generations. So it evolves, and he's talking in terms of maybe a living constitution.
Right.
And it makes sense to me, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion.
Well, right, and I just don't think, so where does our country get off? Because John Roberts wrote in the dissenting opinion this scathing thing about, you know, marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's how it's been defined, and that's how it should remain defined. And I think, why does the state get to decide that or name that? Why do they get to say that it's between one man and one woman? Mm-hmm. And so I totally, of course, I believe in living documents for everything, right? Bible, Constitution, I feel like it always has, you always have to look at things with fresh eyes in order for them to apply to the context in which we live today. Right. So I do agree with Justice Kennedy on that.
One thing before we give it to the audience, you know, we all, I think, would agree that we're very lucky to live in the state of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts seems to be out front on most legal matters anyway. In fact, the U.S. Constitution, many of the articles and amendments that are in that were taken from the Massachusetts Constitution, which predates the U.S. Constitution. In addition, this decision that we're talking about was in 2015. Well, in the state of Massachusetts in 2003, there was a case that you know, validated civil marriages for people of the same sex. So, with that being said,
we are ahead of the curve here in Massachusetts.
We're always ahead of the curve. So, with that being said, maybe someone from our audience would like to give us an opinion, a commentary.
Yeah, question.
And thank you so much for the discussion. It's an important discussion, especially in families, both in religious communities and outside of religious communities that have a great deal of stake into this. My first issue with this is a country like the United States that is grappling with our diversity. And a diversity, if we go to the Reconstructionist stage, as you mentioned, John, which the United States was considered an Anglo-Saxon country. And then by the 1920s, there was a campaign because of the strong anti-Mormonism, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Jewish sentiment, especially from the KKK in the 1920s. They began a campaign which began to create a new narrative for the United States called a Judeo-Christian country. The issue today is, aside from, that we're moving beyond Judeo-Christianity, and that we have fellow citizens who are non-Christian of all kinds of different types of belief traditions, and increasingly non-religious people in the United States. And I would say probably about a quarter of all adults in the United States are unaffiliated. Mm-hmm. They have no connection to a religious tradition. So we're grappling with this diversity as a nation. Right. And honestly, I don't think we have an answer yet. Right. I think we're grappling with it. I think these legal cases are part of that issue, that we're grappling with who we are, what is America, who we are as Americans, as fellow citizens in a very diverse situation that we belong in. And even religious traditions are changing dramatically as a result of all these things. What it means to be religious is not what it meant to be religious in the 1950s. What it means to be spiritual is not necessarily what it meant a few years ago. So I guess what I'm saying is it's an ongoing picture, and we're grappling with it. We're grappling with it so much so that we have Islamophobia, we have anti-Semitism, and a number of other issues that have become upticked, including racial issues as well, and racism. And it's not like, and I think it's all bubbling because of this who are we as a country? How do we pull this polarized country together with all the differences that we truly are?
The right to privacy, you cannot find that in the Constitution. Legal decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court have cited the right to privacy. They have said that it is part of the substance of the 14th Amendment. And the right to privacy in some of the cases that are discussed in this book are whether or not you can buy contraceptives, whether or not you can hand them out from a clinic, whether or not you can engage in sexual behavior, and any number of other things. So the right to privacy, even though it's not delineated in the Constitution, it is part of our jurisprudence, and it's been the basis of many decisions. Right,
including Roe versus Wade.
Right.
You know, so that's also a really important issue that dovetails with that. You know, but I mean, I would throw it back out and say, do you have any thoughts about the whole idea of not having the state issue marriage licenses? Because I'd be interested to hear what you have to think about that, Warren.
Yeah, well, first of all, I see the role of religion and the role of the state are two different things. The state and the government is set up right from the beginning, Declaration of Independence. The reason why governments are created in the first place to be legitimate is to protect the rights and the property of the individual person. And it was not set up with a religious test. There would be no religious tests. It was not going to be establishment of religion, but the rights of individuals to be individuals. I also see that as a right to a religion. I might have a different religious opinion. I have a right to a different opinion, but I also have an obligation as a citizen to respect the position of other people. And this is a difficult thing. What's happening, like Father Carl says, I grew up a WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, in a Congregational church in Needham. And at that time, there was a lot of prejudice against Italians and Irish and Catholics in general. And so I grew up in that kind of atmosphere and things like that. And gradually we got over it. We kind of got used. I became a Catholic later on. I married a Catholic girl, became a Catholic. And now half of my people in church are actually half converts, you know, that mixed marriages or whatever you want. And so I see that as far as the license, I mean, that religious, you have to have a license to confer matrimony.
Yes.
As a minister.
Yes, I do.
So you are empowered by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to declare somebody married. And so where does the state come in here? And I believe that the state has a compelling interest in in regulating certain activities of people. We regulate businesses. You have business partnerships. You have corporations. You have ways of regulating behavior that relates to getting across town, like traffic laws. So the state has a compelling interest in creating an atmosphere to produce the health and safety of the population in general. Where we're going after we die, it's not the state's business, or whether we get there or not, or what we have to do to get there. That's the role of religion, and individual religions can manage their own flock in their own way, and we have to obey our faith, our conscience, according that it's been formed by the religion we're brought up in. The next question is, how do we, in our various religions, get a chance to influence public policy in a secular government in a rational way, so that the best values that we have, morality as it were, get translated into law in a legitimate way, that it was also respecting the rights of other people. So to make those, I see this, so the rights of the individual, and then so when we got married, we had to take a blood test. And
yep, I'm old enough that we had to do that too.
And the reason for that was at the time, there was, I think syphilis was one of the big issues. And the state would not want the generation to have diseases that were transmitted sexually. So before you got married, you had a clean bill of health so that you had permission. So the state had a compelling interest in regulating that behavior. Now, that's not as much of an issue with gay marriage, but it does establish that the state has a right to regulate that intimate behavior. And getting back to venereal disease or something like that, early on, way back when the Supreme Court, when Massachusetts Court came up with that, and I said, of course, it's much better to have monogamy for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're married to a man or a woman. The idea of monogamy and fidelity in matrimony.
So you're getting into a whole other topic on us now, Warren.
So that's now, it kind of like, how important there's moral issues that come in here that are not specifically from a religion, but we would all agree that somewhere that this makes sense.
Right. Well, one of the things you said that it makes me think of something. So in a way, we do have religious bodies who regulate marriage in the sense that I'm part of a denomination where I can freely marry people of the same gender, but my Methodist friends can't do that. I'm guessing Father Carl can't do that. There are denominations. I have Methodist friends who will call me up and say, can you marry this couple? Because they are not allowed. So even though the state says it's legal, in Massachusetts, their religious denomination says that they cannot marry the particular, minister or priest. So in a way, we do have different religious bodies who are making a statement on that and regulating it to some degree.
So maybe to get the rest of the audience engaged, I'm going to throw something out to you. There is, and this is along the lines of what's discussed in the book, and privacy and government involvement in people's lives. There's always been a movement afoot to decriminalize certain activities that are either done in private or are consensual with no victims. Right now we have a number of laws on the books, and if you look at what's in this book, even more so back in time, where they would criminalize behavior done in private by consenting people. What's your feeling about that? Now, back to Warren's point in terms of there's a certain level of morality that we try to sustain, but are we going too far when we go into someone's bedroom or into someone's house and invade their privacy for the sake of enforcing a law where there might not be any victims? Any comments on that?
My name is Linda. I think that becomes an especially important question where we are right now as a society in terms of our technology and the digital footprint that we leave. I think it gets increasingly and amazingly complicated with the proliferation of, every kind of recording device that exists. And, not only that, but in our society, all the apps that make it possible for people to connect with each other in ways that were very taboo would have been to previous generations. So I do believe, kind of coming back to where we're at in terms of discussing amendments to the Constitution, that having a legal document that we all look to as a society, and that we do suspend our individual personal sense of what is right and wrong, and look to a common set of principles for guidance is so important, as this discussion is. These are challenging things to talk about, especially in a public forum.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment. Beth?
Yes.
I'd add to Linda's comment. I'm Beverly. A question for me being, who's deciding?
Right.
Most, especially when you're looking at something, the religious realm, which is purely optional for one to participate in, take advantage of, versus the commonwealth issue. You're born, by virtue of being a citizen, you are part of that jurisdiction. And there are elected persons in the roles of decision-making. There may be, and I'm putting quotes around this, elected individuals who serve in whatever religious group you're part of, but there may also be appointed individuals who coordinate, dictate, and make decisions. So one is set up as a democracy, another one is not necessarily so. And that's just like the biggest wall for me, even watching the two of you talk.
Yeah.
The differences in your worlds, your experiences, that which you literally legislate and that which you morally, religiously, spiritually, and legislate isn't even a comfortable word, so I'm using it recklessly in the spiritual domain. So that's been going on in my head throughout this whole talk. Who decides? And the power of the vote, which we've seen become enormously more and more obvious to American citizens, the power of making the decision about who it is you will have make decisions about your life.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So the questions are a part of that, but the process for me is even more enormous.
Right. Well, I mean, to add to your comment, and thank you for that, I mean, we live in a democracy where hopefully everybody has the right to vote. No votes are suppressed. We can hear from everyone. The laws get passed based on a majority, but we have to keep in mind that we have to respect and protect the rights of the minority that may not have voted for that law. And that's the basis of a lot of what's in here. There were certain laws passed that, to a certain extent, discriminated against certain people that would have never voted for it. And they have to be protected, even though they didn't vote for it, and it is, in fact, a law.
And part of being the protected class, whatever the book was saying, was that what they take into consideration is that there may be not enough, right? They used to be called minorities. So if, women were a minority or gay and lesbian people were a minority, what they would say about it is, well, there aren't enough of them to actually vote for people who would represent them. So we need to make sure, like John was saying, like you were saying, that their views are represented even if they are not able. Now we're able to elect people that can represent our points of view. But I mean, I don't know what you all think, I don't think as close of a decision as it was in 2015 for marriage equality, I don't think that it would have passed unless society had changed, right? Society had changed enough that I think the justices could see the handwriting on the wall and felt that they were going to be more in sync, kind of that living document with where society was. Whereas 10 years before, 20 years before, I don't think that decision would have come down because the society wasn't in that place. But to your point, should it be that way, right? So should it reflect what society thinks? Do we decide as a society who is that? Or do we keep looking back to the Constitution, which doesn't say a lot about a lot of these issues?
The whole basis of this show, the books that we discuss, are based on the amendments and the Constitution. And a point of interest in the book, of historical significance is when the Bill of Rights were written, James Madison came forward and said, if you only write down those 10 amendments, then you're stuck with only those 10 rights.
Right.
And he made sure that the 9th Amendment was put in there, and it's one of the forgotten amendments, but it's very important. And it basically said, if it's not listed in these 10, there are certain rights that people retain.
Right.
And one of them is the right to privacy.
That's right.
So he left an open door with the 9th Amendment, and I'm glad he did, because otherwise maybe we would have foreclosed certain rights that we either had then or we discovered later.
Right. Right. Like, you know, I talked about Roe versus Wade before. That wasn't really an issue when the Constitution was written, so it wasn't something that they could foresee. But for me, again, the whole issue that I come back to is I think we've reached some point, and I say this as a religious leader, it feels like, and I don't remember exactly when the point was, and maybe you have better memories than I do, but at some point, a viewpoint with the evangelical kind of religious right in our country, somehow that got intertwined into politics. And I don't know exactly when that happened, because we are separation of church and state, but then you started hearing people on talk shows talk about their religious views and that those views should be legislated. And they should be electing people that would legislate those views. And I think in some ways, I feel like it slid in there and we weren't really noticing it until all of a sudden it was there. And people were talking about things like abortion, like gay marriage, from a religious point of view, and saying that we need to legislate this. And that's where the libertarians, though I'm not one, would step in and say, well, just wait a minute, right? You know, how involved should the government be in people's lives? And so, the religion became intertwined. And like you were saying, Carl, and now we're trying to unravel that, I think, a little bit in our country with more diversity that we have. We're trying to unravel that and go back to who we are as a people that really doesn't have anything to do with a person's particular religious beliefs. At least that's how I look at it.
Yeah. Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, maybe just to say something off of what you just brought up, and a little connection to what I mentioned before. Pardon me. But there's a mythology in the country, and with many of us religious people, at least from, I say from a national point of view, there's a mythology that somehow we're supposed to be a quote-unquote Christian nation.
Right.
And as a Catholic priest saying this, I'm probably going to get heck.
And you're on camera.
I know. They say, so whatever. But my work is in interfaith dialogue, which includes dialogue with secular friends as well. And this whole grappling with our diversity, both from a religious and secular point of view, and how do we hold ourselves together in the end. But I say it's a mythology because, first and foremost, there was a letter, I think, from George Washington speaking to Mohammedans, Muslims, saying we are not a Christian nation. I guess what I'm saying is there's this sense among a certain sector of Christianity in the United States that have maybe a pretty strong voice in government as part of the national populist movement here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. We see that same thing happening in Latin America and also in Europe. And in all these places, what's going on right now is this sense that here in the United States, how it resonates is really it comes down to back in the 1950s when there was a strong anti-communist fear and threat that things like one nation under God, indivisible, it was added in the early 1950s. And the whole idea, so there was this sense that those who were, communists, they were heathen and whatever that meant at that time, that was destroyed. What happened is it coupled American principles with religious theology. And we're kind of stuck with it right now, particularly in this national populist movement.
Yes.
So there's, as a result, there's this expectation, as Justice Roberts wrote, which is a Christian principle, but not just a Christian principle. It's a Muslim principle. It's a principle among Orthodox Catholic churches and amongst other Christian communities as well, and Jewish communities, but not all communities. And so this is, right now, again, I'm going back, we're struggling with our diversity, and we haven't figured it out. And I guess one of the biggest things that helps us to figure it out is how we sit down and dialogue with one another.
Right, which is what we're doing
now.
Right,
exactly. We sit down and we talk with each other. We get to know each other. We get to understand each other. I mean, one of the things this comes across is we were having a conversation in the green room, and about the importance of interfaith literacy and in our public school system, in our education system, about part of that is, of course, the separation of church and state. We're not proselytizing. We're not purporting a particular religion in public schools. But is there a way for public school students to understand the extraordinary diversity of this country, religiously and non-religiously, through the curriculum? Yeah. So I just want to open to you.
Yep.
Yeah.
I just add to that. I mean, we're talking about tolerance here, a respectable discussion between people that might differ on very serious topics, but the tolerance has to be there. It's not the person that shouts or yells the loudest. It's the person that maybe is more persuasive in their argument. So anything to add to that?
Well, just as when Carl was talking, it did make me feel, and, again, we can have a wide-ranging conversation, so it's not just limited to, but it did make me think, I think about today, the people of the religious right who elected President Trump, who will say, we know that he doesn't morally stand to the test of what we teach. Talk about marriage, fidelity, talking about monogamy. I don't need to say any more. But he represents the things that we want legislated, primarily anti-abortion and also anti-gay. To some degree. And so they're willing to say, well, we don't really care about who he is as a person. Not so much. What we really care about is he going to legislate our religious beliefs? And that's where, it's not that I don't think they're entitled to their religious beliefs. They can believe anything they want in this country. But that's where it's what you were saying, and Bev, what you alluded to, where I start to bristle is well, wait a minute, we're a secular country. That's our strength. So think what you want. But don't elect people because you think they're going to legislate your religious viewpoints. And that's where I feel like we have run into a lot of trouble. And again, we're trying to figure that out now and back away from that.
It was mentioned that, this is a democracy or a republic, which is bottoms up. And public opinion, whatever it is, how it gets there, is ruling. Coming from a religious perspective, there's fear that religion is not a democracy. A theocracy is an autocracy, an authoritarian, top-down, directed. And we are assuming that, God brought this down and this is written in the book and, we have to obey. When I was going to school that was Protestant majority, they gave the prayer. We read from the King James Bible every morning, and when they did the Lord's Prayer, all the Catholic children had to stop when we got to deliver us from evil. And there was really the distinction between just Christians and Catholics at that time, never mind the rest of the diversity. And that tension was, and the Catholics feeling threatened by democracy in a way. And they finally they had to build the parochial school so they could program their children the way they wanted to. They didn't want them to be influenced by us Protestants at the time. And the fear, too, is school education brings children up to ultimately, we bring them up in the way they shall go, and they should not depart from that. So how do you educate a citizenry to run a world, democracy? And we need to have people kind of trained up. So there's the tension between authority from above and what I'm trying to get to is I think that the evangelicals in this period are really a minority. They're a minority in Christianity, and they see themselves as a persecuted minority and fearful of the Muslims moving in, people coming up from South America, just as many people were fearful of the Catholics coming in. And we can't have, until JFK came along and we got the first Catholic president, how long it took before we could accept a Catholic to be a president of the United States.
We still have not had a Jewish president or a woman president,
yeah, that's what
or an openly gay or lesbian president.
Or a Hindu president.
Yeah, so we have a really long way to go. We do have an educator in the audience, but I didn't know if you had anything to add about the role of the education system in that.
I have strong feelings about the work, the honor of the work of educators, to have the opportunity to teach children about what it means to be in a democracy. Sadly, not all schools are fully integrated even, and I don't mean just politically, just even geographically, therefore politically. So it's not a matter of every school being a pure melting pot, but schools have the greatest opportunity, I think, public schools, to help children see that they have lots of things in common with other age mates, and they have lots of things that are different with age mates. And it's become, in my opinion, I'm retired now, but 30 years in education, and I can say it became increasingly more complex to have conversations, or have allowed children to have conversations even about their individual religious practices, not so much their beliefs. Because in school, religion is not part of the curriculum. It is certainly part of the soft, unwritten curriculum about children learning to know about one another and likenesses and differences in families. And it's a wonderful place for those kinds of learnings to take place. It's a wonderful opportunity because I think most schools, I don't know that I can say that literally that I know that, but in my belief and certainly in my own experience, all schools have been open to increasingly more parental participation and family involvement, which is all part of children's cultural and religious understandings and celebrations. So I think it's a great place where children can notice, learn about, ask questions about, even challenge what goes on for other kids in their lives, and think they can spearhead conversations at home. Again, it's also sticky because not all families feel really comfortable about school having those conversations.
Right.
And I parallel the predicament I put you in, which is, who put me in charge of that?
Right.
I was in charge of a school,
Right.
but nowhere did it say I also could make decisions about every single conversation that took place in the building.
Right.
And so I faced lots of challenges from families. Very happy to share their stories. Weren't always so happy to hear other families share their stories. And there's nothing written about that. I live in that case, I split both worlds. There were some rules and laws about how I could function,
Right.
and there were some squishy places where my belief system may have been more operative than, somebody else would have liked.
Right.
So it's a great place. It also is up for, lots of conversation because of the wonderful diversity in schools.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to add one quick thing to that, and I'll turn it back to you, is that a role that education can play. When my youngest son was a freshman at Concord Carlisle High School, there was anti-gay graffiti in one of the bathrooms, and the way that they handled it was the faculty who were gay and lesbian, they held an assembly, and they told the children how that made them feel. And they told some of their personal stories, what they had been through, and what it made them feel like when they saw or heard about the graffiti in the high school. And my son, who doesn't tell me a whole lot, came home from school that day, and that was the first thing he wanted to talk about and tell us, and he was amazed at the stories. And he said, you know, I didn't really think about it before, but after hearing their stories, now I understand why that graffiti was so hurtful. So it's, again, having those conversations that help us to bridge the divide.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight. You know, we started in one subject matter, but kind of broadened the scope. But there's nothing wrong with an open discussion. It gives everybody a lot to think about, whether they're in this room or they're viewing from home.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank our studio audience for your contributions, your thoughts, your ideas, and any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Again, the whole reason we do this show is just to start a conversation. So we hope you'll go out and you'll continue the conversation, and we hope people who are viewing at home will have the conversation, because that's really the only way that we can come to understand one another and to bridge those divides. So thank you.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.